Okay, and I think moving on to the geographic impact of growth, Scott.
Thank you. This is really interesting. So I'm an MP for Edinburgh, and some people in Edinburgh would say this is just yet more investment in the southeast of England. You know, a long-term problem the UK has had, I think. So how are people in Edinburgh and elsewhere outside the southeast England going to benefit from investment in airports?
Well, I guess the main argument would be that if you're looking to fly to distant cities for trade, you know, and I think the important thing for growth would be to create business opportunities or technology transfer to boost the productivity we've been talking about. On many routes from the UK, there just aren't enough passengers to make it viable. So you need to consolidate those passengers in a hub, i.e. in London. So the benefit might be that businesses, in particular in Edinburgh, would be able to use those flights in order to generate business and trade.
How does that differ from changing my flight to Amsterdam? How does that differ? How does that benefit Edinburgh more?
It doesn't.
Exactly, yeah.
It doesn't. And lots of people in the north of England, of course, do transfer via Amsterdam or Dubai. So that benefit to Edinburgh can be served by hubs elsewhere. You know, I would say that the majority of those benefits will come in the region of London, particularly with some of the high tech clusters that we've got in the region around London rather than Edinburgh.
Anyone else on that?
I do think it's worthwhile kind of when you talk about what are the benefits for somewhere like Edinburgh. In the past, there's been discussions around like how do you boost domestic connectivity, because the fact is, and shown out in the modelling for the Airports Commission previously and for the National Policy Statement, that domestic flights within the UK from Heathrow, from those major airports as they grow, are going to be priced out. And the only way to maintain that connectivity is going to be through public subsidy or through basically government action to enforce domestic routes. And yeah, so I think that's just something to bear in mind.
I think I'd maybe add as well that capacity constraints at Heathrow come at a cost to the UK in general. So when there are capacity constraints at our only hub airport and the main gateway for long-haul markets, that will come at a cost. So at Heathrow, we have seen passenger volumes increase in recent years, but that's airlines really trying to squeeze out the most they can get. The number of flights are capped. Heathrow's been operating at full capacity for around 20 years. Airlines can deploy larger aircraft, have bigger load factors. They can switch out some short-haul connections for larger capacity, long-haul connections, which I think dampens some of the domestic connectivity that we're talking about. So ultimately, the UK ends up less well connected. There'll be sort of lower frequency on the existing routes that we have, and there'll be fewer connections added because they're squeezed out for sort of the high demand routes. I think we know also that when demand exceeds supply, ticket prices rise. We call that the congestion premium, seen in loads of markets, so whether that's London house prices or tickets for Oasis and Taylor Swift, prices rise. And that means that the passengers who fly end up paying more to do so. But then there's a whole load of passengers who cannot fly, and that activity is being squeezed out. And all of the business passengers or even the leisure, the visiting friends and relatives that would have happened, all of that activity doesn't happen. And as I mentioned before, I think the productivity and the well-being effects, they ripple throughout the economy. They're not just located in the southeast. I mean, I think if a Japanese manufacturing firm was thinking about investing in a new factory in the northeast of England, I think...
Edinburgh.
Then, yeah. So I think air connectivity will play an important role in kind of their decision there as well. And I think I'd just point out, I think that the DfT forecast that by 2050, with capacity constraints, I think there might be as many as 100 million passengers per annum that would have flown if we had the capacity, that won't fly if we don't have the capacity. So that's kind of 100 million passengers per annum. It's a lot of people. I'm sure there'll be lots of different anecdotes in there around business travel, leisure, and it will be impacting the entire country.
The fundamental challenge here again is considering strategically what is it that we're facilitating here, because despite the stated capacity constraints at Heathrow, the business passenger share at Heathrow has been in decline. So there's something not quite right about the logic of this, because all the models suggest that when business passengers are there and they exist, they're willing to pay quite a significant amount more than a leisure passenger is to travel. So if there is capacity already in the system, which there is plenty, there is 300 million passenger movements coming in and out of the UK every year. We are widely regarded as one of the best connected economies in the world. If that connectivity is there and there is business demand, that business demand should be fulfilled within the current system. It will displace the low-value leisure flights, whether that be at a regional airport or through Heathrow, and that is borne out by the DfT's modelling. But that's not what's happening. If anything, it's moving in the opposite direction. So if we look at the latest data from 2024, what we see getting added to the network is more leisure destinations, more resort destinations. 680,000 more passengers now going to Antalya and 220,000 to Dalaman in Turkey. Massive growth in Greece, massive growth in the Canary Islands. Now, these destinations are not business destinations. There's massive increases in spending in these places, of course, which is another question as to whether it's good for regional economies, for national economies like Scotland's, to encourage our residents to spend more money, to use a silly analogy, but on dental work in Turkey and other places. That's not helping the UK economy. That is just the reality of it. And what we're seeing, though, if you sort of scrutinise those destinations I've just described that are seeing so much growth, is that they are getting kind of longer haul. Right? We used to just go to southern Spain. Now we're going further for these sort of resort destinations to the Canaries. 4 or 5 hour flights we're talking about now. And I guess the question is, if you therefore are going to expand Heathrow and enable further long-haul destinations, which is principally what Heathrow does, are we just now encouraging those people to go to Bangkok, making it cheaper to go even further? Now, yes, there's probably a welfare benefit to those individuals involved. I'm not going to deny that's the case. But strategically, that's a huge cost to the climate and to wider society, and is that really worth it? Especially when we then consider that those leisure passengers are often frequent flyers who are taking advantage of this. I mean, it's only viable to go to Turkey to get your teeth done because the flights are so cheap. It's, you can get off-peak flights for 30 quid. So how is it beneficial for our UK regions to encourage that type of spending is the question we need to be asking. And if there is this untapped business demand, there are business people in Edinburgh needing connectivity, why are they not being fulfilled already within this massive connectivity, this network we already have? And are there policy interventions government could pursue to chase that green growth, which would be to say, fulfill the business need, but without increasing the overall passenger load and damaging the climate in the process?
Okay, thank you.
Interesting, but I have to change topics very, very slightly. And I think we've touched on this a little bit. So reading the notes that we've been provided for today, I think one of the things that cuts through is that it seems to be quite difficult to actually measure the economic impact of the aviation sector, and even more difficult to predict 60 years into the future, I think, what we're talking about here. So why is it so difficult, and how much uncertainty is there around those future predictions 60 years into the future?
In terms of the impact on the UK economy?
Yes, sorry, yes, thank you.
The income.
Yeah, sorry, I can have a go at that. Frankly, it's quite hard to measure some of these difficult to estimate impacts, right? So in terms of productivity and well-being, the Green Book and WebTag provide guidance on how to carry out cost-benefit analysis, but it's exactly that. It's guidance. It's high-level guidance. It doesn't provide a detailed step-by-step guide for how to carry out cost-benefit analysis for every single conceivable type of investment. And at Heathrow, expansion at Heathrow, there's lots of nuances there. There's international cross-border impacts. There's all this sort of productivity and sort of well-being impacts as well. Green Book does say that you should be trying to measure these productivity benefits where possible, but it notes that they're very hard. Similarly, on the well-being side, try to include them where possible, but it's very, very hard. So the science is evolving in that space. You said in terms of different results producing or different studies producing different results. I would point out though, if you look at the analysis that was carried out by the Airports Commission, and they carried out lots of different types of analysis, not just one. And if you look at the results from the DfT last time around in 2017, 2018, and some of our recent results as well, they all point to sort of very strong net positive cases. So the science will change, and some of the inputs will change as well. So, for instance, Heathrow's passenger forecast and its plan on the ground may subtly change. I think earlier this week they said they were looking to maybe accelerate some of the expansion. So that will obviously have a different impact in terms of costs and benefits. So I think with these things, it's a moving target in terms of the plan on the ground. It's very, very hard to actually estimate some of these.
So how much uncertainty then, when you look 60 years into the future, how much uncertainty is associated with some of the numbers that have been bandied around?
Well, there'll be lots of uncertainty, which is why I think it's really important to carry out lots of different types of analysis as well. So I think the Airports Commission, they produced thousands of pages of analysis, carrying out different approaches, lots of qualitative arguments as well, talking about the importance of hub capacity and so on. Frankly, there is uncertainty because these things are hard to estimate. But when we see, so many people flying, I think it's a great thing to be able to get your teeth done quite cheaply abroad in Turkey. Maybe people quite like that, frankly. And so many businesses flying each year. The benefits must be there.
I'm sure this government has a commitment to ensure everybody gets access to an NHS dentist. Did you want to comment on that, Mark?
So I can talk a bit more about why economists disagree generally with those kinds of reports, but just on the topic of forecasts and those scenarios, one of the things I think is very interesting and kind of that maybe is worthwhile taking into consideration of the DfT updated appraisal of the Airports Commission work. So as said, they did a bunch of different scenarios. Now, one of the things to note is that one of those scenarios was around, for example, high carbon costs. What if we're in a world where carbon costs are much higher than what was assumed in 2017? We are in that world. The DfT guidance now is high carbon costs as a central case. There's now a higher cost. If you look at that scenario, none of the things considered at that time are net positive according to the DfT's assessment.
Yeah. Uncertainty.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think you need to take forecasts, particularly 60 years out, with a great big pinch of salt, because we just don't know. No one knows.
Alex?
I think also really important to note that given, as we've said, the centrality of business passengers to all of these big numbers, when you put out these big productivity benefits, it's always the business passengers that are driving them. And the Airports Commission, it looks very likely, are fundamentally wrong in the forecasts that they put out in 2014 and 15, because they anticipated growth in the business passenger market quite significantly by 2030. Now, we're not at 2030 yet, so there's still possibility of a huge turnaround. But as opposed to growth, their baseline was 2011. We're looking at the moment at being below that level, which means all of the figures that contributed to the models that they put out, models that actually were, many people had deep concerns about their veracity, as we'll hopefully get to at some point. But nonetheless, those models were based on these forecasts that have been proven to be wrong. And that comes from typically an over-optimism, a bias towards an optimistic view of what the future is rather than a realistic one, which we now need to have, I think, at this stage.
Okay.
Is the fall in domestic connectivity or passenger numbers, is that not so much driven by airports switching to overseas routes, but by the decline in business travel within the UK? Because fewer people, I live in Edinburgh, pre-COVID, lots of people would come to Edinburgh for a tour, London, they'd go to Edinburgh as well, for a 2-hour meeting and then nip back again. And I see that on the train. I use the train every week, and it's dominated by leisure travels now. Even I don't travel first class, but even in first class, I can see it's leisure travel rather than business. So is that change not what's driving the change in the domestic market, rather than airports switching to overseas routes?
I'd say there's probably a combination of different factors. So I think in terms of, during the pandemic, I think it's undeniable that many businesses took to Zoom and Teams and found that actually for certain types of meetings, it's really not bad. So you can imagine a scenario where you've got, say, intra-company meetings where you have 4 meetings a year, we all meet in the head office. You can imagine a scenario now where you think, actually, how about we just do 1 meeting a year face-to-face? Let's throw a big social event at the same time and we'll do the other ones on Teams. So I think in that respect, I think sort of the online meetings is a real complement to aviation. But I think for some of those really important entrepreneurial meetings like pitches and conferences and where face-to-face meetings are really important, they continue to be as important as ever. In terms of why there might be a reduction, I think the higher ticket prices at Heathrow could also be in part explaining that as well. So lots of different factors at play there, I think.
Okay, thanks. I think, Brian, initially, in terms of the timing of the announcements, 2 weeks ago, up until 2 weeks ago when the Chancellor announced that the government was going to support Heathrow as part of a wider package of growth proposals. And therefore it was only today that we had the confirmation from Heathrow that they did want to go for a runway 3 and expanded capacity on the current terminals. So assuming the government started this process, do you feel that the government's done the necessary groundwork to support this policy, given the time elapsed and significant changes since the department's last appraisal?
I certainly wouldn't want the enormous work that the Airports Commission did having to be repeated. I think there would be value in examining some of the key issues. We've talked about the importance of the hub status because we are seeing new aircraft coming along. Some of the narrow-bodied aircraft which do extra long range, they can provide long-haul distances between cities where before it wasn't viable. So I think it would be worth having a look at some of those issues. Of course, we haven't discussed the cost. I mean, one of the issues with the Airports Commission review was that it was the third runway was a very expensive option, which meant that although there were big benefits, the net gain was not very large.
Alex,
I think an awful lot has changed. The Airports Commission did do a kind of options assessment, I think, in the sort of interim phase, although I'm looking over here because you're more expert on what went on there. I believe that options assessment in terms of different ways of fulfilling the kind of UK's transport connectivity needs identified some things like Brexit, like EU legislation as obstacles to some of the options they could have explored. That has now been removed. I think the change in trends in business passengers has to be explored. And this government, I think, I might be putting words in their mouth, but I think what they want is green growth. So there's an exercise here to ask, can we secure these growth benefits, but without the environmental cost? Are there other options available to optimise what we can do with the system? And I do think that we probably should be looking at this question about the hub and spoke approach as well, because the world again is moving on. Schiphol is the classic example of another hub airport that we are in competition with, and yet over there they are also having this debate, and the airport itself has produced reports saying actually we're not sure that our own growth is in the societal interest. So when major competitors are asking those types of questions, the world has changed. And I think the government needs to have a careful look at what its strategic aims for aviation are. And alongside other issues like, for example, the fact that the Channel Tunnel is 50% below capacity. We've got assets. Why not sweat those assets in ways that don't damage the climate as much as the Heathrow case example would?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. As I think your next question, I think, has mainly been covered.
Just a little sliver of it. So, and it's the hub and spoke models we mentioned a few times, and as a passive observer to the aviation sector, I think over the last 20 years there was a bit of debate about should we go to even bigger aircraft to connect between these hubs, or should we much more point to point. And going back to Edinburgh, of course, I have to mention Edinburgh. I mean, the Scottish Indian community, they'd be delighted to have a direct connection between India and Edinburgh, rather than going via Heathrow. So I thought we'd moved away from hub and spoke, but investment in Heathrow is about hub and spoke. You're shaking your head. Hub and spoke is here to stay.
I think it is, yes.
Right, okay.
But both. Because I think what we've seen are new aircraft that are able to operate between cities economically, which they weren't before, offering point-to-point services. But those same aircraft are being used to make the spokes of the hub more effective. And I think that we are still going to be in a situation, not many cities, or the majority of cities, have to get service via a hub because there just aren't enough passengers to offer a viable service for a direct service. I think that's going to be with us forever. We're going to need a hub and spoke airport, but new technologies are opening new opportunities for a direct service.
And that argument applies equally to freight.
Freight doesn't care whether there's a direct service or not.
Yeah.
You know, if a box can go anywhere, it's just the economics, the cheapness of it. So it's mostly for business passengers that it's important.
Well, and perishable goods.
Yes.
Okay, Mark.
I did just want to add on the point around kind of the hub and spoke. In terms of evidence that has been previously put towards the Transport Select Committee for the Aviation National Policy Statement, what they found there, yes, doing an expanded third runway at Heathrow would get between 7 and 11 more destinations, long-haul destinations from Heathrow. At the UK level, the modelling at the time found it was 1 more destination. So that was 10 to 6 being taken from other airports where they would have been point to point.
To add to that, we should recognise that comes with job losses. So we, at NEF, we put a Freedom of Information request in about 2020 to the DFT to ask them for their analysis of the impact of Heathrow expansion on the wider regions. And what that showed is that although we keep hearing this 100,000 jobs figure, which has an awful lot of problems with it, one of the problems with that figure is that's not the sort of aggregate UK level change, that's jobs in the southeast. And there was a potential up to 27,000 job losses around the wider regions that would be lost particularly in those wider regional airports because they could serve those routes and they would move to Heathrow if they didn't. So I personally think we do need a more transparent conversation at exactly how these different approaches to the system affect economic factors like those jobs.
Lawrence, you wanted to come in?
But in terms of the precise timeline, at the moment, we're waiting for Heathrow's formal proposal to us in the summer. As the Minister says, we then need to conduct an AMPS review. It is then for the scheme promoter to bring forward at ECO. The Chancellor, I think, in some of her comments has set out an ambition for flights taking off from 2035. And I think Heathrow are aware of that ambition, and that will be relevant, I'm sure, to their consideration of how quickly they can bring these things forward.
Oh, you had a question.
Thank you. Thanks for calling on today. For some reason, you keep on mentioning Manchester Airport in your examples, and you mentioned those reserve slots that you hoped that Manchester would get. Now, I don't speak for Edinburgh Airport, which is just outside my constituency, but I think the point they were making to me was that there's untapped capacity in Luton and Gatwick, and what people using Edinburgh Airport want is more point-to-point flights rather than going via hubs. And I expect people using Manchester Airport are exactly the same. They want to go straight to their destination rather than go through Heathrow. But one of the concerning points that was raised in the previous session was that a Heathrow might rob those regional airports of those longer distance flights. And it means that what is now currently point-to-point, they may have to go via Heathrow. Is that a positive? Is that something you've considered? And should people not be coming from Manchester to London by train?
Or even Edinburgh.
Or even Edinburgh. We could segue into Avanti's performance for the past few years. It's interesting for me, Chair, as a young Manchester councillor and a campaigner, we're the only city that has built an international runway in the past 80 years, despite what others may say, which means our capacity to go to 55 million, and we currently have 200 point-to-point destination flights. Having said that about how good my airport is in my constituency, it will never, ever, or I'd say in my lifetime, get to some of the destinations that people need to go to. They will still have to hub out of somewhere. At the moment, a lot of business people and others in my constituency hub out of Schiphol, or they hub out of Dubai and take the weekend. I'd much prefer that pound is spent in the UK hubbing out of our hub airport if it's humanly possible.
What is that pound if they go via Heathrow rather than Schiphol? Is that the cup of coffee they buy in the Cafe Nero or whatever in this new Heathrow Airport?
£10 sandwich.
Is that the economic benefit? Is that it?
I think the economic benefit is that we have the capacity within the UK that people can get to anywhere in the world, and we are one of the most connected countries upon the planet because of our superb aviation system that I said at the top. And most of that is because Heathrow has got those number of destinations. With all the will in the world with our great cities, we're not going to penetrate some of those markets. That's because of population issues around those regional national airports, and also the public transport penetration, which isn't as good as it is in the southeast. I would like to see that better, and I know you've worked in this field yourself.
We're interested in ground transport.
In ground transport, of course, yes. But if we could improve that as well, I know that Edinburgh Airport, Manchester Airport and other regional airports could penetrate further point-to-point markets. But for now, if we want to stay competitive in an international system, we have to invest in our hub airports as well. Thank you.
Thank you.